On the evening of June 2nd, 2023, 9-year-old Israel Owens was playing in an open field near his apartment complex in Ocala, Florida. It was a warm Friday night, and the kids in the neighborhood were doing what kids do, running around, laughing, enjoying their freedom. Israel had left his iPad in the grass and went back to grab it. That's when his neighbor, 58-year-old Susan Lorincz, appeared. She was holding his tablet, and she was angry. Before Israel could even ask for it back, Lorincz threw the iPad on the ground. Then she picked up a roller skate and hurled it at the boy, hitting him in the foot. When his older brother tried to intervene, she came at them swinging an umbrella. Israel ran home to get his mother. But before we get into today's story, if you enjoy deeply reported true crime cases that spark important conversations about justice and community safety, then you're in the right place. Because that's exactly what we cover here, and I upload new stories 3 to 4 times every week. So if that interests you, please gently tap the like button and subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future uploads. All right, let's get into today's story, which takes place in Ocala, Florida in 2023. Ajike Shantrell Owens, everyone called her AJ, was 35 years old, and the kind of mother who made everything look effortless even though it wasn't. She was raising 4 kids on her own: 12-year-old Isaac, 9-year-old Israel, 7-year-old Africa, and 3-year-old Titus. She worked as a manager in the restaurant and hospitality industry, pulling long shifts to make ends meet. But somehow she still found time to be the team mom for her kids' football and cheerleading squads. She'd show up at practices with snacks, help with uniforms, volunteer in classrooms. Her Facebook page was filled with photos of her children's accomplishments: report cards, funny videos, milestones. Her life revolved around those 4 kids. Friends described AJ as confident, bold, fun-loving. She had perfectly applied eyeliner, long straightened hair, and the kind of warm smile that made you feel welcome. She posted inspirational quotes about faith and self-affirmation. One of her favorites said, "In order to save myself, I first had to destroy the me I was told to be. I am something new now." She'd survived being a young single mother and had built a life she was proud of. The Owens family lived in the Quail apartment complex, a tight-knit community where neighbors knew each other and kids played outside together while adults watched from their porches. It was the kind of place where children would run between apartments, where families looked out for each other. But there was one neighbor who didn't fit that description. Susan Lorincz had moved to Quail around 2020. Almost immediately, tension started building. She worked from home and complained constantly about noise. Specifically, she complained about children, particularly the Black and Latino children who played in the open field near her apartment. Lorincz had placed no trespassing signs in the field, even though it wasn't her property. She'd come outside and yell at the kids, call them names. Other neighbors reported that she would record the children on her phone, trying to provoke reactions. She'd flip them off behind the camera, and she used racial slurs. According to later police reports and neighbor testimony, Lorincz had called children the N-word, told them, "Get away from my house, you black slave," and said, "This isn't the Underground Railroad, slave." She called them bastards. One neighbor recalled Lorincz saying to children playing outside, "One day you guys are gonna die." Between January 2021 and June 2023, Susan Lorincz called 911 at least 6 to 8 times about neighborhood children. The police body cam footage from these visits shows a pattern. Lorincz would complain that kids were trespassing, being too loud, stealing her signs, banging on her door so hard they broke the frame. She told deputies she needed peace and quiet to work. She claimed the children were threatening her, that they were calling her names. But when deputies spoke to other neighbors, they got a different story. Multiple residents told police that Lorincz was the problem, that she was hostile, aggressive, and racist toward the neighborhood kids. One neighbor told deputies, "She's crazy. She yells at the children all the time." Another said she would purposely antagonize them. Despite the repeated calls and growing concerns, no effective intervention happened. No mediator was brought in. No social worker tried to de-escalate the situation. The tension just kept building. By early June 2023, Ajike Owens was well aware of the problem. Her children had told her about Lorinc's behavior, but Ajike was a protective mother who believed in standing up for her kids when they were being mistreated. She'd taught them to have dignity, to not let anyone degrade them. So when Israel came running into their apartment that Friday evening saying that Lorincz had thrown things at him and his brother, Ajike knew she needed to address it. She walked over to Lorinc's apartment with Israel beside her. Here's what happened next, based on 911 calls, police body cam footage, witness testimony, and the subsequent investigation. At 8:53 p.m., Susan Lorincz had already called 911, reporting that neighborhood children were trespassing on her property and that she felt threatened. The dispatcher told her officers were on their way. Just 8 minutes later, at 9:01 p.m., Lorincz called 911 again. This time, she reported that she had fired a gun through her door. When Ajike Owens arrived at Lorinc's apartment, she knocked on the door. According to Lorinc's own statements to police, she could hear Ajike yelling, demanding to know why she was throwing things at her children. Lorincz claimed Ajike was banging so hard the doorframe cracked, that she was screaming threats, that she feared for her life. So Lorincz grabbed the .380 caliber Remington handgun she'd purchased a year earlier after a previous confrontation with Owens. She walked to her front door, which was closed and locked, and she fired a single shot through it. The bullet struck Ajike in the chest. She collapsed on the ground right in front of her son. Israel, still just 9 years old, watched his mother fall. He ran screaming for help. His older brother Isaac came running. When emergency responders arrived minutes later, they found Ajike unresponsive on the ground outside Lorinc's apartment. The children were hysterical. Paramedics performed CPR, loaded her into an ambulance, rushed her to the hospital. But it was too late. Ajike Shantrell Owens was pronounced dead shortly after 10 p.m. One of the first things police noticed when they arrived was that Susan Lorinc's door showed no signs of forced entry. It was intact, except for the bullet hole. Ajike had been unarmed. And here's the crucial detail that investigators would later emphasize. Lorincz had already called 911. She knew police were on their way. She could have stayed in her bedroom, where she kept the gun. She could have waited 8 minutes. Instead, she chose to fire through a closed, locked door at a woman standing outside her home. When deputies arrived and took Lorincz into custody for questioning, she repeatedly insisted she'd acted in self-defense. "I thought she was going to kill me," she told them over and over. She said she was terrified, that she'd acted impulsively out of fear. She admitted she'd yelled at the children in the past, admitted she'd used racial slurs out of anger. When detectives gave her the opportunity to write an apology letter, she did, explaining that she acted out of fear, that she was afraid Ajike was going to kill her. She never mentioned the fact that Ajike had been on the other side of a locked door, that she'd been unarmed, that her 9-year-old son had been standing right next to her. But here's where things get even more disturbing. Susan Lorincz was not arrested that night. She wasn't arrested the next day either. Marion County Sheriff Billy Woods announced that his department needed time to evaluate Florida's Stand Your Ground statute before making an arrest. This is where the case exploded into national news. Florida's Stand Your Ground law, first enacted in 2005, allows people to use deadly force if they reasonably believe it's necessary to prevent death or great bodily harm. The law removes the duty to retreat, meaning you don't have to try to escape or de-escalate before using lethal force. And crucially, it places a presumption of reasonableness on the person who used force. In other words, prosecutors have to prove the person wasn't acting in self-defense, rather than the person having to prove they were. This law has been controversial since the beginning, with critics arguing it enables shoot first, think later behavior and disproportionately affects black victims. Now it was being invoked by a woman who had shot an unarmed black mother through a locked door while police were already on their way. For 5 days, Susan Lorincz remained free while Ajike Owens' family buried their daughter and sister and mother. 5 days while 4 children tried to process that their mom was never coming home. 5 days while the community held vigils and demanded justice. Civil rights leaders, including Reverend Al Sharpton, traveled to Ocala. Sharpton would later give the eulogy at Ajike's funeral, speaking directly to her children. If she allowed people to degrade you, you'd grow up with a feeling that you were something that could be degraded. Finally, on June 7, 2023, 5 days after the shooting, Susan Lorincz was arrested. She was charged with manslaughter with a firearm, culpable negligence, battery, and 2 counts of assault. Notably, she was not charged with murder, because prosecutors determined the evidence didn't support that she'd intended to kill Ajike Owens. But they also determined that her actions absolutely did not qualify as lawful self-defense under Stand Your Ground. The investigation revealed details that contradicted Lorinc's story. The timeline didn't match her version of events. Forensic evidence showed Ajike had not been trying to break down the door. Witnesses confirmed that while Ajike had been yelling and knocking, demanding to know why Lorincz had attacked her children, she had not been attempting to force entry. And perhaps most damningly, detectives discovered that Lorincz had researched self-defense laws online. She knew what she needed to claim to invoke Stand Your Ground. She'd prepared for this possibility. The case went to trial in August 2024. The defense brought in expert witnesses who testified that Lorincz suffered from PTSD stemming from childhood abuse, that she'd been in a heightened state of fear during the confrontation. Character witnesses from her church described her as a devoted Christian, a good friend, someone who took care of family members. Her attorneys argued that her traumatic past had impaired her judgment in that moment of stress. But prosecutors emphasized the facts. Lorincz had called 911. Police were on the way. She knew this. She had time to retreat to another room. The door was locked. Ajike was unarmed. And there were witnesses, neighbors who heard the confrontation, who saw what happened, whose testimony contradicted Lorinc's claims of mortal danger. Ajike's 2 oldest sons, Isaac and Israel, were listed as potential witnesses. The prosecution ultimately didn't call them to testify, relying instead on neighbors, forensic experts, and the timeline of events. The thought of those children having to relive their mother's death on the witness stand was something everyone wanted to avoid. The jury, which was all white, deliberated and returned with a verdict: guilty of manslaughter. They rejected Lorinc's Stand Your Ground defense. In November 2024, Susan Lorincz stood before Judge Robert Hodges for sentencing. Ajike's family had asked for the maximum sentence of 30 years. Lorincz spoke in court for the first time since the shooting. "I am so sorry I took Ajike's life," she said. "I never intended to kill her." She claimed she'd been confused and scared. Judge Hodges acknowledged that Lorincz had no prior criminal record, which factored into his decision. But he was clear about the severity of what she'd done. "The shooting was completely unnecessary in this case," he said. "You called 911. You knew law enforcement was on their way. You could have stayed in a bedroom where you kept your firearms, and the victim showed no effort to enter the residence." He sentenced Susan Lorincz to 25 years in prison. She's currently serving that sentence at the Homestead Correctional Institution in South Florida. Her projected release date is April 8, 2048. She has filed an appeal. But the verdict and the sentence don't bring Ajike Owens back. Her 4 children, now aged 6, 9, 12, and 14, are being raised by their grandmother, Pamela Diaz. The trauma runs deep. Israel, who watched his mother get shot, blames himself. He told his grandmother, "I couldn't save her. I couldn't give her CPR." His older brother Isaac feels guilty too, believing that if he hadn't left his iPad in the field, none of this would have happened. Both boys are in therapy. Little Titus, who was only 3 when his mother died, became confused, irritable, and inconsolable in the weeks after her death. He was too young to fully understand, but old enough to know his mom was gone. On the first anniversary of AJ's death, the children gathered with family to honor her memory. Africa read a poem that included the line, "My mom is my hero. Forever will she be in my heart." Pamela Diaz has channeled her grief into activism. She co-founded a nonprofit called the Stop the Gap Fund, which helps families affected by gun violence with unexpected expenses, funeral costs, therapy, relocation, security when they receive threats. She's become an advocate for reforming stand your ground laws, arguing that they enabled tragedies like her daughter's death. No sentence or verdict can ever bring full peace or accountability for what was taken from our family, Diaz said after the sentencing. "Our focus remains on honoring Ajike's legacy through justice, healing, and community care." The case has become a touchstone in debates about stand your ground laws, about how neighborhood disputes escalate into violence, about the intersection of race and self-defense claims. Legal experts have pointed out that if there had been no witnesses to this shooting, the presumption under stand your ground would have favored Lorincz, and the case might never have gone to trial. That's how powerful these laws are, and how easily they can be invoked, even in cases where the threat was never real. The tragedy of Ajike Owens remains one of the most heartbreaking examples of how quickly a neighborhood conflict can turn deadly when fear, prejudice, and access to firearms collide. Whether you believe stand your ground laws serve a legitimate purpose or enable unnecessary violence, the facts of this case are clear. A protective mother confronting someone who had just attacked her children was killed through a locked door while police were already on their way. If you found this story as important as I did, I've got another case examining controversial self-defense laws you need to see. Click the video on your screen right now about the case that first tested stand your ground protections and changed how America talks about self-defense. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories like this. Thanks for watching. Until next time, see ya.